The police regretted arresting this elderly black veteran, and 30 minutes later, FBI agents arrived. Drop a comment below if you've ever faced discrimination or been unfairly judged because of how you look or what you wear. Let's talk about it. It was an ordinary morning in Tucson, Arizona, and as I entered Monarch Federal Bank on Speedway Boulevard, nothing about the scene felt out of the ordinary. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and a few customers sat quietly going about their business. The air was filled with that quiet tension that usually accompanies a workday, the sort of atmosphere where you don't expect anything out of the ordinary to happen. The line at the counter was short, and I waited behind a man in a neon landscaping shirt who seemed in no rush. When it was finally my turn, I walked up to the counter, greeted the teller with a polite smile, and made my request, a simple withdrawal from my personal account. What I didn't expect was the cold response from the branch manager, Thomas Harris. Thomas wasn't someone I had seen before, his appearance was that of an ordinary man in his early 50s, dressed in a maroon tie and thick rimmed glasses. He didn't greet me with the warm customer service I had come to expect, nor did he even look at me as though I were someone he should recognize. Instead, he casually glanced at my ID and then immediately began questioning me. "We can't process this today," he said, offering no explanation beyond the vague suggestion that there had been incidents before. But what exactly that meant, I wasn't sure. But the moment he said it, I knew something was off. "I don't understand," I responded, trying to stay calm. "Is there a problem with my account?" His response was dismissive, almost mocking. "Let's just say we've had people try to pull large sums before," he said with a smirk. His words stung, and the way he dismissed me felt like more than just a simple oversight. It felt personal. I knew that my account was in good standing, and I wasn't some random person trying to scam the bank. Yet his refusal to even check the account was a clear sign of bias. He hadn't bothered to verify anything, and instead he had decided what kind of person I was based solely on how I looked and what I was wearing. It wasn't about the withdrawal anymore. It was about respect. I was the CEO of the company that owned this bank, but instead of recognition or even a simple verification, I was treated like a criminal. There was no apology, no attempt to correct his mistake, just an immediate assumption that I didn't belong. That was the moment when I realized this wasn't just about a simple banking transaction. It was about how people like me were viewed by those in positions of power simply because we didn't fit the mold of what they expected a leader to look like. As I stood there trying to process what had just happened, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. The arrogance in Thomas's demeanor was infuriating, but what struck me even more was the fact that none of the other employees seemed to be speaking up. There I was, standing at the counter of a branch that I had helped build into a trusted financial institution, yet I was being treated like an outsider, someone who had no right to be there, simply because I didn't fit the stereotypical image of someone in charge. I stood quietly, holding my ground, trying to keep my emotions in check. The tension in the air was palpable, and I could feel the eyes of the other customers subtly turning toward me. It wasn't just Thomas's behavior that bothered me. It was the silence of the others around me. They watched but did nothing, as if this was the norm, as if this kind of treatment was acceptable. I glanced at the teller, Rachel, who seemed uncomfortable, her eyes darting nervously between me and Thomas. She wasn't the one giving me trouble, but she was complicit in the silence. There was a part of me that wanted to speak up, to say something, to ask why no one was standing up for what was right. But I knew that would only escalate things further. It wasn't just about this transaction anymore. It was about the broader issue of how people in positions of authority treat others when they believe no one is watching. I could have raised my voice, demanded that someone else take responsibility, but I didn't. Instead, I calmly asked Thomas again, "Have you even looked up my account before deciding I'm not who I say I am?" His response was another dismissive gesture. "I don't need to look up every ID to know when something feels off," he said, crossing his arms defiantly. I was taken aback. The arrogance, the complete disregard for basic verification procedures, it was unbelievable. I had given him everything he needed to prove my identity, yet he chose to ignore it simply because of how I looked. "You don't think I'm who I say I am because I don't look the part," I said, my voice steady but filled with a quiet resolve. At that moment, I could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on me. The man behind me in line shifted nervously, and Rachel, the teller, looked like she was unsure of what to do. It was clear that they were all waiting for the confrontation to escalate. But what was happening wasn't just a confrontation, it was a systemic issue, one that I had seen time and time again in my career. The biases, the assumptions, the way people are treated differently based on how they present themselves. It wasn't just happening here. It was happening all over the country, every day. I stood firm, trying to keep my voice calm. "I suggest you check my account now, Thomas," I said, keeping my eyes locked on his. He seemed to hesitate for a moment before he finally shrugged and motioned to Rachel to take over. But the damage had already been done. He had shown his true colors, and it was clear that he didn't respect me or my position, despite all the work I had done for the company. His response was rooted in assumptions about who I was and how I should behave based on my appearance, not on my qualifications or my identity. As Rachel typed in my account information, I could feel the room holding its breath. When the system confirmed my identity as the CEO of the bank, the atmosphere shifted. But instead of apologizing or acknowledging his mistake, Thomas returned to the counter with his clipboard in hand, acting as though nothing had happened. "Now that we've verified who you are," he said, his tone still dripping with condescension, "I suppose we can proceed with your withdrawal." But by then it was too late. The damage was already done, and nothing he could say would change the fact that I had been treated like a nobody in my own bank. The moment that followed was one of the most surreal I've ever experienced. As Thomas returned to the counter, there was a palpable shift in the air. The tension that had been building in the room seemed to take on a life of its own. People were still watching, and I could feel their eyes on me, some with sympathy, others with curiosity. No one said anything, but the room had become charged with unspoken thoughts. I wasn't sure if it was the gravity of the situation or the feeling of being watched by so many people that made it so intense. But I knew something had to change. I couldn't let this moment slip by without doing something to address the deeper issue. I didn't just want to resolve this withdrawal. I needed to show everyone, both inside the branch and those watching, that what had just happened wasn't okay. It wasn't just a bad customer experience. It was an example of how unchecked bias could seep into the way business was conducted, the way people were treated. I looked at Rachel, who had gone noticeably quiet and was nervously typing into the computer, and I could see the tension in her eyes. She was doing her best to stay neutral, but I could tell she was uncomfortable. "Do you see the name on my ID?" I asked softly, trying to keep the conversation calm. Rachel hesitated for a moment, then nodded, looking down at the screen in front of her. She knew what she was seeing, but she was still processing it. "Kendra Braxton," I said, making sure she heard me clearly. "Now, when you type that name into the system, what do you see?" Rachel's fingers moved slowly across the keyboard, each click echoing in the stillness of the room. A few seconds passed before she spoke again, her voice just above a whisper. "I see, an executive account. Kendra Braxton, CEO." The realization dawned on her, and I could see her expression change. She looked back at me, wide-eyed and almost apologetic. But before she could say anything, Thomas returned. He had clearly been waiting for the right moment to reassert his authority, clipboard in hand, and a look of forced confidence on his face. He was clearly trying to regain control of the situation, but it was too late for that. "Is there still an issue?" he asked, his voice sharper than before. I could feel the eyes of everyone in the room shift, all of them now fully aware of what had transpired. The tension was thicker than before, and I knew that what happened next would make all the difference. I wasn't angry, not in the way you might expect. There was no shouting, no dramatic outburst. Instead, I spoke calmly but firmly. "You refused to verify my identity before making an assumption," I said. "You spoke to me with sarcasm and dismissed a valid ID, and now you're trying to tell me how to do my job?" My words hung in the air for a moment, and I could see the shift in Thomas's demeanor. The smugness that had been so apparent earlier was slowly starting to crumble. But then, in that very moment, I knew it wasn't just about Thomas anymore. It was about every other person in the room. The customers who were witnessing this exchange, the employees who were standing by silently, the people who had watched him treat me like I was invisible. I wanted them all to understand that this wasn't just a matter of one man's rudeness. This was about how we allow these moments to pass by unchecked, how we normalize the mistreatment of others when no one speaks up. I didn't want to make a scene, but I needed to make a statement. The message was simple. It wasn't enough to let this go. It wasn't enough to walk away. And so I stood my ground. I'm not here to cause trouble, I said, my voice steady but resolute. I'm here to see if you're capable of doing your job. And right now, you've shown me that you're not. It was the kind of moment that changes everything. It wasn't just about getting my money or about a simple transaction. It was about holding someone accountable for their actions and making sure that this kind of treatment didn't go unchallenged. As the words left my mouth, I could feel the room change once again. There was a strange kind of electricity in the air, as if everyone could sense the shift in power. It was no longer about the money or the withdrawal or even about me. It was about accountability, about standing up to the kind of behavior that had become so normalized. Thomas may have thought he was in control, but in that moment, he was losing his grip. He didn't understand the gravity of what he had done. I could see the slight twitch in his jaw, his attempt to hide the embarrassment. He had underestimated me, and now he was beginning to realize the cost of that mistake. It wasn't just about a simple misunderstanding. It was about what that misunderstanding revealed. His assumption that I didn't belong there, his belief that I was unworthy of respect. And in front of everyone, that assumption was being shattered. Thomas, ever the man trying to maintain control, seemed to falter, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for a way out. He wasn't used to being called out like this, certainly not in front of customers. He cleared his throat, his voice shaky as he tried to assert himself once again. You know, we could have handled this differently, he muttered, as if somehow trying to justify his actions. But it was too little, too late. The damage had been done. As he turned to walk away, I could see the unease in his step. He didn't know what to do next, but I did. I wasn't finished yet, and I wasn't about to let him off the hook. I took a deep breath and made the call. It was the call that would change everything. I didn't need to shout or make a scene. I simply needed to make sure that the right people knew what had happened. I dialed the HR department and spoke calmly, explaining the situation. I told them about the treatment I had received, how I had been dismissed and made to feel as though I didn't belong in my own bank. The voice on the other end of the line was steady, but I could hear the concern behind it. "We'll take care of it," they said, and that was all I needed to hear. The wheels were in motion now. But Thomas, still oblivious to the extent of his mistake, continued to walk around the branch, clearly trying to salvage what little of his authority remained. He was holding his clipboard like a shield, and I could see him sneaking glances at me, as if hoping I would back down. But I wasn't going to back down. Not today. Not after everything that had happened. The employees were watching, the customers were watching, and I knew this was a turning point. For all the wrong reasons, this moment was going to be one they remembered. When Thomas finally returned to the counter, clipboard still clutched tightly in his hands, he looked more rattled than ever. I had expected him to apologize, or at the very least, to acknowledge his mistake. But instead, he tried to regain control in the most passive-aggressive way possible. "Well, I suppose we can proceed with your withdrawal now," he said, his tone still tinged with condescension. But I wasn't interested in his hollow words anymore. I had already made my decision, and it was clear that his presence was no longer necessary. I turned to Rachel, who had been quietly watching the exchange. "Thank you for your help," I said, offering her a small smile. She looked relieved, almost as if she had been waiting for someone to say it wasn't her fault. But I couldn't just let this moment slide by. I needed to make sure that everyone in the room understood what had just happened. This wasn't about one man's disrespect. It was about the system that allowed that disrespect to flourish, unchecked and unchallenged. And that was something I could not tolerate. I was done with the withdrawal. It wasn't about that anymore. It was about making sure that Thomas knew, really knew, that his behavior was unacceptable. And so I waited, calm and composed, as the call from HR came in. The silence in the room was thick with anticipation, and I could see the staff and customers alike feeling the weight of what was happening. They weren't just witnessing a transaction being processed. They were witnessing a moment of accountability, one that they would all remember. As I stood there, the room heavy with silence, I couldn't help but feel a mixture of emotions. The situation was far from resolved, but in that moment, I knew something important had shifted. Thomas was trying to maintain his composure, but it was clear he was losing control of the situation. He had no idea what was coming next, but I did. I could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on me, all of them waiting to see how this would unfold. I wasn't angry. No, this wasn't about anger. This was about holding someone accountable for their actions and making sure that this kind of behavior wouldn't be tolerated in the future. The way Thomas had treated me was unacceptable, but it was the silence from everyone else that bothered me the most. They were complicit in letting this slide. They were watching, but they weren't speaking up. It was as if they had resigned themselves to the idea that this was just the way things were. But that was the problem. If we didn't speak up when we saw injustice, how could we ever expect it to change? I wasn't just there to get my money back. I was there to make sure that this would never happen again. Not just to me, but to anyone else who walked through those doors. When I received the call from HR, I knew it was time to make the final move. The voice on the other end was calm, but I could hear the seriousness behind it. "We've reviewed the footage. We've got everything we need," they said. "We'll handle it from here." There was no hesitation in their voice. It wasn't just about making a correction. It was about making sure that this kind of behavior would never be allowed to continue. I knew that the right people were now involved, and Thomas's days as manager were numbered. But there was still one thing I needed to do. I needed to make sure that everyone in that room understood why this was happening. It wasn't just about one person's mistake. It was about the culture that had allowed it to happen in the first place. The way people had been treated simply because of how they looked, how they dressed, or the assumptions others made about them. That was the real issue. And it wasn't just happening at this branch. It was happening in workplaces across the country. People were being judged not by their qualifications, not by their ability to do their job, but by superficial things that had no bearing on their value as human beings. And I couldn't let that go unchallenged. I looked at Thomas one last time before he was called into the back office. His face was pale, and he was clearly trying to keep his composure. But the confidence that had once been so evident was now completely gone. I wasn't sure if he realized the gravity of the situation yet, but it was clear he was beginning to understand. "You've made your choice," I said to him, my voice steady, "and now you'll face the consequences." He didn't respond. He just turned and walked away, defeated. The door to the back office clicked shut behind him, and the atmosphere in the room shifted once again. It was as if the weight of the situation had been lifted, and for the first time that day, the tension seemed to ease. I could feel the employees around me exhale, as though they had been holding their breath the entire time. They were relieved, but I could tell they were also a little shaken. They had witnessed something they had never expected to see. Thomas was going to be fired. The decision had already been made. But for me, that wasn't enough. I wanted to make sure that everyone knew why this happened. I wanted to make sure that this wasn't just a one-off incident, something we could brush under the rug. This was about creating a culture where accountability was more than just a buzzword. It was about making sure that people like Thomas didn't get away with treating others as though they were inferior, simply because of their appearance or their position. When I gathered the staff together, I could see that they were all on edge. They had witnessed something that many of them had never seen before, a moment of true accountability. And it was clear they didn't quite know how to process it. But that was okay. This was a learning moment for all of us. I stood before them, taking a deep breath, and said, "What happened today wasn't just about one person's mistake. It was about how we allow people to be treated. It's about respect. We can't let things like this slide, no matter who's involved. We need to hold each other accountable." I could see the staff listening, absorbing what I was saying. Some of them looked ashamed, while others seemed to be reflecting on their own role in the situation. I wasn't there to shame anyone. I was there to teach them something important, that it wasn't enough to remain silent when you saw something wrong. That silence was just as dangerous as the behavior itself. As the staff gathered around me, there was a stillness in the air that felt almost heavy. They stood there, each person lost in their thoughts, some of them visibly uncomfortable, others trying to process the magnitude of what had just unfolded. I knew that the experience had shaken them, as it had shaken me. We had just witnessed a breakdown in professionalism, yes, But we had also witnessed something much more profound: the power of standing up for what was right, even when it's hard. And that was the moment I wanted to seize. It wasn't enough to simply acknowledge what had gone wrong. It was important that we all understood why it mattered and why it couldn't happen again. We talk a lot about respect, integrity, and leadership, I began, my voice steady but filled with a sense of urgency. But real leadership isn't about what you say in meetings or what you write on a piece of paper. It's about what you do in the moments that count. And today, when you saw something wrong, some of you stayed silent, others hesitated. That hesitation is what allows things to go unchecked. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle in the room. It was clear that some of them hadn't even realized that they had witnessed an injustice, and even more had never imagined that they would need to step in. But now they knew. It wasn't about creating a culture of fear, but one where we empowered each other to act when things went wrong. And I needed them to understand that. I know it's hard to speak up when you're not sure if it will cost you your job, your reputation, or your position, I continued. But this is how change begins, by making sure that we treat everyone with the respect they deserve, regardless of what they wear, how they speak, or what they look like. That is the culture we need to build here. And that starts with each of you. I saw a few heads nod, a few of them making eye contact with me as if for the first time. The truth was, we had all allowed these subtle forms of disrespect to become normalized. I wasn't exempt from that either. In my years of running Monarch Federal, I had never had to face something like this personally, but I had seen it happen in other places, and I had seen how easy it was to overlook. But what had happened that day wasn't about one manager or one situation. It was about all of us. It was about how we allowed things like bias and disrespect to seep into our professional lives, and how, if left unchecked, they could poison the entire culture of a workplace. I turned to Rachel, the young teller who had been quietly following my lead. "You did the right thing today by following the system," I said. "But remember, when the system isn't enough, when it lets someone down, you have the power to speak up. You are not just following orders, you are part of creating an environment where everyone feels safe and valued." She looked at me, her eyes still wide, but there was something different in her gaze now. I could see her processing, seeing things in a way she hadn't before, and that's what mattered. The change wasn't about what had happened to me or even what had happened to Thomas. It was about what was happening right then and there in the room with the staff. It was about planting the seed for a new way of thinking. "It's not just about doing your job," I said, addressing everyone now. "It's about recognizing when something is wrong and having the courage to step in, to say, 'This isn't right and I'm not going to let it slide.' You don't have to be a manager to lead. Leadership is about how you respond when no one's watching." I could see that the room was shifting. There were no more nervous glances or hesitant looks. Everyone was focused, understanding that the lesson wasn't just theoretical. It was real, and it had real-world implications. I wanted to make sure that when they went home that night, they didn't just think about the situation. I wanted them to carry it with them, to recognize those moments when they might feel like staying silent or looking the other way. I wanted them to understand that in those moments, they had a choice. "Today wasn't about me," I said, my tone softening. "It was about us, about the kind of bank, the kind of company we want to be. And if we don't start holding each other accountable, if we don't make sure that these moments of disrespect don't slip through the cracks, then we're just as guilty as the person who lets it happen." The room was still, everyone thinking deeply. For some, this might have been the first time they'd been confronted with this kind of truth. For others, it was a wake-up call. But for all of us, it was the beginning of a new understanding. A commitment to doing better, to being better. As I stood there looking around at the faces of the staff, I could sense a shift, a quiet determination to make things right. I didn't need to say anything more. They had heard me, and more importantly, they had felt the gravity of the situation. And that was what would make all the difference. I turned and made my way to the door, knowing that the lesson had been delivered and that change had already begun. It was time to move forward, but we would do so with a renewed sense of accountability. And with that, I left the branch, knowing that the work had only just begun. The moment I left the branch, I could feel the weight of the day slowly begin to settle. There was still so much to process, but I knew that what had transpired wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of the challenges we faced as a society, the biases we all carry, sometimes unknowingly, and how easy it is to let these things go unchecked. What happened at Monarch Federal that morning had the potential to be a teachable moment, not just for the staff at that branch, but for the company as a whole. I knew I had to take that lesson and make sure it didn't just stay in one room or with one group of people. I had to take it beyond the walls of that bank. The next few days were a blur of meetings and phone calls, and yet the message was clear. The culture had to change. This wasn't just about one employee, one manager, or even one branch. It was about the kind of organization we were and the kind of organization we wanted to be. I immediately set up a meeting with the regional VP, Roland, who had come to the branch after the situation unfolded. He and I had worked together for years, and I knew that we were on the same page when it came to values. As soon as I sat down in his office, I got straight to the point. We need to address what happened, and we need to address it now, I told him. No. This isn't just about firing someone for inappropriate behavior. It's about setting a precedent. It's about making sure that this doesn't happen again, not just at this branch, but across the entire company. Roland nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. What do you need from me? He asked. I'm going to implement a mandatory training session for all employees, I said. Not just on customer service, but on recognizing bias, addressing microaggressions, and understanding what it means to foster an inclusive environment. We're going to do this the right way, and we're going to hold everyone accountable. Roland was quiet for a moment, and I could see the wheels turning in his mind. I think that's exactly what we need, he said finally. But we also need to make sure that leadership understands this too. It's not just about the staff on the floor. It's about making sure our managers are leading by example, that they're setting the right tone. We need to make sure that everyone knows what the standards are. He was right. The problem wasn't just with Thomas, it was systemic. It was about how people in positions of power made assumptions about others, how they treated people differently based on their appearance, or how they allowed their biases to inform their decisions. It was about the leaders in the organization creating an environment where these things were not only allowed to happen, but were, in some cases, ignored. I'll be meeting with the senior leadership team next week, I said, and I'm going to make sure that this message is clear. No one gets a pass on respect. No one gets to disregard our values, and no one gets to treat another human being with a disrespect, regardless of who they are or where they come from. Roland agreed, and we both knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Change never is. But the foundation had been laid, and now it was time to build on it. Over the next few weeks, I spent countless hours working with HR, organizing the training sessions, and speaking with other managers across the company. I shared the story of what had happened, not to shame anyone, but to show them the reality of how biases could manifest in the workplace. I wanted them to understand that this wasn't a problem that was limited to one branch or one manager. It was something we all had to confront, something we all had to work on. As the training sessions began, I was encouraged by what I saw. Employees were engaged, asking thoughtful questions, and reflecting on their own experiences. It wasn't easy for everyone to confront their own biases, but it was necessary. It was uncomfortable, yes, but it was also liberating. People began to realize how much power they had in shaping the culture of the organization, how much their actions and their willingness to speak up could make a difference. It wasn't just about following the rules, it was about standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Over time, the atmosphere in the branches began to shift. There was a greater sense of awareness, a growing understanding that we all had a role to play in creating a workplace where respect was non-negotiable. People were no longer afraid to speak up when they saw something wrong. They had learned that their voices mattered. They had learned that they didn't have to stay silent when they saw injustice. And for me, that was the most important lesson of all. As I continued to visit branches, I could see the impact of the training sessions. Employees were engaging in more meaningful conversations. Leadership was becoming more attuned to the needs of their teams, and the overall environment was changing for the better. It was a slow process, but it was progress. And that's what mattered. I had set out to change the culture of Monarch Federal, to create a place where respect, inclusivity, and accountability were the pillars upon which we stood. And although the work was far from over, I knew we were on the right track. It wasn't just about one person or one incident. It was about creating a legacy of change that would last for generations to come. And as I reflected on the journey, I realized that the most powerful lesson I had learned wasn't just about fighting for respect. It was about using my position to make sure that everyone, no matter who they were, had the opportunity to be seen, heard, and valued. That was the kind of leader I wanted to be, and that was the kind of company I wanted to build.